Hello, I'm Tom Gosling, Executive Fellow at the European Corporate Governance Institute, and I'm here today with Antonio Mello, Frank Graner Distinguished Chair in Finance at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, to discuss his paper, Why Do Firms Not Have a CEO Succession Plan, co-authored with Francesco Celentano, Assistant Professor of Finance at HEC Lausanne. So Antonio, a very warm welcome.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate the opportunity. The ECGI is one of my favorite think tanks, a very important combination of intellectual power and applied force, and a very positive joint venture between academia and this industry.
Well, thank you. And to start with, can you just explain the main reason why firms might want to have a succession plan and outline the prevalence of CEO succession plans in the market? And in that context, perhaps explain what motivated you to undertake this study.
Sure. So CEOs are the leaders of corporations. They set the strategy, they make key decisions regarding the top personnel, and they have an instrumental influence on the culture of the organization. So for this reason, the departure of a CEO has significant implications for a corporation. And in our data over the last 20 years, so we do it for 98 to 2018, slightly every year, 10% of the CEOs leave a company for different reasons. Either they are fired or otherwise they leave voluntarily. And the costs associated with the turnover are substantial. Predicting a CEO turnover is very challenging for the reasons that I pointed out. There are many reasons that can explain. And the CEO, when a departure occurs, the implications can be serious, very damaging for the corporations if they are caught off guard. And leaderless firms, they have to scramble to find a replacement. Resolving the succession dilemma. And if they do it in a rush, then what might happen is that they come up with a temporary replacement, which is not good because that person has limited power, or otherwise they might decide to go for an unfit CEO with potentially long-lasting detrimental effects on the corporation. When we look at the surveys, what we find is that 40% of the publicly listed companies in the largest market, and we're talking about the largest corporations in the largest and the most developed market in the world, don't have a succession plan at the end of our sample. And this is after the SEC into 2009 effectively mandated the disclosure of CEO succession plans. So we asked 3 questions. The first is whether the disclosures are after this SEC as just checking the box, or are they just responding to changes in the regulatory environment, or otherwise if they are genuinely committed to mitigate the adverse impact of a CEO departure. The second is whether CEO succession plans add value to corporations. And the third one, which is actually the title of the paper, is why at the end of our sample, approximately 10 years after the SEC required the firms to mandate that the firms would disclose CEO succession plan, we still have many firms without a CEO succession plan.
Yeah, I thought it was a surprisingly high proportion that admit to not having any sort of succession plan. And in the first part of the paper, you make 3 main empirical observations about the benefits and costs of having a succession plan based on an analysis of forced turnover. Let's start with the benefits of having a plan. What did you find?
So we find in terms of the benefits one is the associated pecuniary losses when a CEO leaves a company are relatively low. They still exist, but they are relatively low, especially when the CEO is appointed internally. The second benefit is that the CEO succession plans improve the accuracy of the information about successes when the CEO is appointed internally. we looked at the forced CEO turnovers, so firings, and focus on what happens to the average firm profitability. And what we find is that companies with a plan, corporations with a plan, in terms of the average excess profitability, does not decline as much. The second is that it falls less the year before the year of a firing compared with companies without the plan. I'm talking about the excess profitability. And the third one is after the firings, if a firm has a plan, it remains negative profitability for just 1 year. If the firm has not a plan, we find that it might take 5 to 6 years to recover. So the evidence suggests that having a CEO succession plan, when in terms of a forced CEO turnover, reduces the monetary losses and has long-lasting effects.
In that context, it's perhaps surprising that everybody, not everybody has a plan. And so you then look at the costs of adopting a plan,
right?
And you split it into financial and personal costs. So is it costly to have a CEO succession plan? And if so, in what way?
So the costs are essentially, as I said, the financial cost is not, it exists a financial cost. In other words, especially when performance starts to deteriorate and we expect a turnover, in other words, a forced turnover. But let me go back to the issue before. What we found in terms of the pecuniary financial costs, it's not just when there is a forced turnover, but also when there is a voluntary turnover. We see a significant difference between companies with and without a plan. So the financial costs of adopting a plan are low. In other words, we don't see a change in performance. We don't see a change in profitability. In terms of the personal cost, and that explains why the board is reluctant to adopt a plan, we can see that they are significant, and it might be because of these frictions, tensions between the CEO and the board, because the CEO might perceive a lack of trust or a higher likelihood of being replaced. And the fact that there is identified, the companies have identified a potential successor does not makes the task of adopting a plan and pursuing a plan a delicate task for the board.
I found this identification of personal costs very, very interesting. I advised boards in practice for 20 years or so, and I've really seen that dynamic play out, especially with a dominant CEO. And you don't claim causality for your findings because of various selection effects, but do you think it's plausible that not having a CEO succession plan is or could become a signal of an underlying governance problem in the board, with directors not prepared to stand up to the CEO?
Not having a succession plan is an indicator of imperfect fiduciary duties on the part of the board. So bad governance. You have experienced, I have experience being on the board of companies. And if you look at major scandals, they are related to negligent and irresponsible governance, what we observe. And the greater the power of a CEO, the higher the personal cost to the board to impose checks and balances that limit the concentration of power.
So using the model that you develop in your paper, you make some predictions about the contributions of different factors to the costs and benefits of a succession plan. What were some of the key findings that you came up with there?
Okay, so let me divide this into parts: the adoption of a plan, the initiation of a plan, and then the use of a plan. When we're talking about the adoption of a plan, so the board is more willing, more prone to adopt a plan if the turnover seems imminent. And that depends on the number of years the CEO has been at the company, for example. At the same time, profitability obviously is a kicker and for performance. And what we tend to see is when there is a dip in profitability, the boards are more likely to use a plan. And following adoption, what happens in the model and the evidence is that either the CEO shows that he's able to recover fast, or otherwise he's going to be replaced. So you have this kind of V function for firms that have a plan in place. So the CEO has to convince the board that that is able to recover. The other thing is that the board, if they adopt a plan, then they receive a signal, they receive information about the internal candidates, and at the same time, the board learns about the CEO ability to manage the firm. And the quality of the signal is very important because that helps the board avoid bad CEOs and retain good CEOs. Consequently, therefore, the signal, the information that the board receives is, if it's of good quality, then ex ante, it makes the board more prompt to implement a succession plan. Another fact is, as I mentioned, the disutility of the board to adopt a plan. And now, if the board has a plan, the board is constantly comparing the quality of the CEO with the, let's call it the group of people that potentially can replace. So there is an internal contest between the current CEO and the potential heirs, and the higher the difference between the two, the more likely the CEO is going to be replaced and the board adopt a plan. Now, talking about the use of the plan is different. So suppose that the board has adopted a plan, now they have to decide whether to use it or not. Then the contest is different. We're talking about when they have to make a decision to use the plan and appoint an internal candidate, they're going to look at two things. If we don't do that, if we procrastinate, then we face the problem of turnover costs. But we already have a plan. But it might be that the individual, that the internal candidate that is supposed to succeed the CEO, upon receiving a signal, the board realizes that that person doesn't have the qualities that we want, or the company needs a big shakeout. So they go for an external. The board has the possibility of hiring outside. So the contest here is between insiders versus insiders. And at the same time, always taking into account that if they don't do anything, then they might face turnover costs. And what we find is interesting is that if the turnover cost can be significantly reduced by the protocols and the processes that the company has established upon adopting a plan, they might, if the reduction in costs are significant, they might go for a suboptimal, a second choice inside, just to avoid, because if they go outside, they don't save the turnover costs. So they might go for a not so good CEO inside and talent candidate, just to avoid the cost of going outside and choosing an external candidate. The other thing that the model shows us, and it links with the data, is that suppose that the signal, the information that they get is very precise. So now the board knows that using a plan gives them the possibility of collecting very good information. Okay, it doesn't mean that the candidate is good. It's just the protocols and the process that they have in place are good enough to give them good information about whoever are the candidates inside. Then the board is going to be a little bit more patient and say, let's wait for one guy who's very good, because we have a process in place that allows us to wait for a very good person, and therefore we delay replacing the CEO, the existing CEO, just because the processes are very good. The succession plan is very good. And that's what we have.
Very interesting. I mean, and overall, you find that succession plans are beneficial, and indeed, a very striking finding from your model was that mandating succession plans would increase shareholder value by just over 3%, which is a pretty large effect. Do you think this is a reform that the SEC should make, or would it have unintended downsides to it?
Well, I mean, we know the role of the mission of the SEC. The SEC is to protect retail investors, right? From insiders who manage the assets and have a lot more information. So directors have a fiduciary duty towards shareholders and specifically to minority shareholders. A failure of governance is detrimental to retail investors, and that's part of the mission of the SEC. And a mission of promoting well-functioning capital markets. At the same time, we have to remember that when there is a scandal, when there is a failure of governance, that has reputation effects and contagion effects to the whole stock market. So it might lead people to be more reluctant to invest in the stock market because they are suspicions about the quality of governance. And that implicitly has implications for financing corporations and even macroeconomic effects. So that's the role of that. To me, it's important to have this kind of mandate it's more than a recommendation, it's a mandate. Now, the question is how to do it. And that's something that needs to be done very carefully. And it's better to do it establish sound processes and good protocols, what a good succession plan is, but we do not require that you have a list of candidates. Okay? We have to give you the option of going outside if that's the case. But at least we have to be sure that you have to establish good protocols and good processes. So it's more effective to mandate good processes and protocols than to micromanage the decision making.
Yeah. And actually, I mean, you could argue that given shareholders themselves benefit, and they could probably enforce this by taking a very strict voting policy, say voting against the chair or the CEO if there is no succession plan. I mean, why do you think shareholders don't push for this more? Do they face their own personal costs?
Okay. Well, let me say that I don't have a complete answer because we looked at 3,000 largest companies in the United States. And usually the ownership is dispersed. When you have dispersed ownership, most of the shareholders are not qualified, they're not informed about the details of the process and the course, and they don't have the ability to coordinate their actions. It's very hard. And you can see that because a lot of the general shareholders assembly, a lot of people simply do not vote. But what we find in the data that it's the role of institutional shareholders, and companies which have more institutional shareholders, usually there is less conflicts of interest and also the ability to implement good succession plans. So in my view, indeed, institutional shareholders seem to be key players in this regard.
Right. So they're already playing their role.
Yes.
Well, I mean, Antonio, thank you so much. That was a fascinating discussion. It's a great paper on I think, a very important issue. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on it with us today.
What a pleasure to be here, and I congratulate you for the initiative that you have.
Thank you.